Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org.
Hello, today's podcast is a continuation from last week. It's part 2 of the Second Income Plan.
As we said earlier, the Second Income Plan is a way to build more purchasing power into every American family. It would do this by helping them buy and own shares of stock in American industry and thus have a second income from dividends. The plan has two important historical precedents. The first precedent was the Homestead Act, which in 1862 opened up the frontier and helped us become a nation of landowners, or small capitalists. And remember, in those earlier days of rural America, land was our most important kind of productive capital. This broad ownership of capital lasted for several generations until modern machines made small farms unprofitable, and most of us moved to town to live in rented houses and work for wages. The second precedent was the Federal Housing Administration, which in 1934 set up the FHA Home Loan Insurance Program, and for the first time made it possible for an average family without prior savings to acquire a home on an insured loan. Both the Homestead Act and FHA were good, practical ideas that worked. The Second Income Plan is the essence of these two good ideas combined into one. Like the Homestead Act, it would help individual families own a share of the capital that is now producing most of the wealth. And today, our most productive kind of capital is industry. Like FHA, it would set up a self-supporting insurance fund that would insure bank loans with which families without prior savings could buy new corporate capital in the form of stock. Incidentally, a loan to buy capital is actually more insurable than a loan to buy a house, because capital can pay for itself, while a house cannot. The Second Income Plan is in keeping with all the great traditions of America. It helps the average little guy gain some economic independence, so to a degree he can be his own boss. It helps all families become independent on private incomes instead of public handouts. It distributes to each according to what he produces, not to each according to his need. It reduces the role of big government, and it eliminates the need for redistribution. It cuts taxes. And it provides America and American capitalism with a magnificent response to the challenge of communism, a response that would be heard around the world. The plan is broad enough to encompass all shades of political opinion, from right to left. It is conservative in that it ends the need for redistribution and thus reduces the role of government. It cuts taxes and it preserves private property. On the other hand, it is liberal in that it really does more for the little guy than all the government welfare schemes thus far devised. For the first time since the Homestead Act, the average little guy could get a chance to own some productive capital. Like the Homestead Act and FHA, the plan could be initiated with no great revolution. All it requires are two basic steps. Step A, establish the national policy, either by amending existing law or by enacting a new law. Let's call it the Full Production Act of 1960 blank. And then step B, implement the national policy through a series of ways and means worked out by both business and government. And here is a partial list of these ways and means. First and most important, set up an insured loan program similar to FHA, whereby families without prior savings can borrow from conventional lending sources like banks to buy a portfolio of qualified, newly issued industrial stocks which would pay for themselves and then would pay the family a second income from dividends. We will explain this program more fully a little later. Now here's the second ways and means. Finance urban renewal projects so the displaced families can acquire stock in the new enterprises and thus get a second income from dividends. Or third, finance government water and power projects like TVA, so the families who live in the area can become stockholders and thus get a second income from dividends. Or fourth, finance industrial development in depressed areas like Appalachia, so the families who live there can become stockholders and thus get a second income from dividends. Fifth, we could finance antitrust divestiture like DuPont's sale of General Motors stock, so thousands of families can become stockholders and thus get a second income from dividends. Sixth, finance sale of government-owned assets like General Anilin, so thousands of families can become stockholders and get a second income from dividends. Seventh, we could encourage corporations to set up more and better employee stock ownership trusts. This converts employees into small capitalists. It also offers a way for the owners of closely held corporations to sell out to their employees if they want to, and it allows the employees to buy the stock with pre-tax corporate income. Thus, we can use existing tax law to help employees acquire stock ownership and get a second income from dividends. Eighth and lastly, change the death tax to encourage the wealthy to spread out their wealth, tax-free, to many more families. Now let's look at these several ways and means in more detail. Going back to the first and most important one, here is how a typical family without prior savings might acquire a portfolio of newly issued stock on an insured loan. The borrower here is the head of a family. He goes to any bank and applies for an insured loan with which to buy a group of newly issued stock. Under this program, the government, through proposed legislation, would set up an insurance fund like FHA, which we have named the Capital Diffusion Insurance Corporation, or CDIC for short. Incidentally, this same insurance function could be provided by a private insurance syndicate. CDIC works just like FHA in that it insures the lending institution, in this case a bank, against any default on the stock loan. The bank then lends the money so the head of family can, with a small down payment, buy the stock. Now, typically, it might be a 6 to 8 year loan, long enough for the dividends to repay the loan. The family pledges the stock to secure the loan, just as they would mortgage a house to secure an FHA loan, and thus the stock remains in a bank escrow until the loan is paid in full. Meanwhile, the family pays a small insurance fee to the CDIC insurance fund to cover the cost of insuring the loan. Again, just like FHA. And again, like FHA, this insurance fund would thus be self-supporting. Now, how would the stock pay for itself, and how long would it take? Despite any widespread notion to the contrary, most mature corporations actually earn about 20% on their invested capital. The figure would be even higher if it weren't artificially held down by accelerated depreciation, investment credits, and the like. Today, however, most of this 20% gets siphoned off before it ever gets to the stockholder or capital owner. Roughly half of it goes for corporate income taxes, and about a quarter of it usually gets plowed back for expansion. This leaves only about a quarter of the 20%, that is, about 5%, for the stockholder. Under the second income plan, almost all of the corporate earnings could go to the stockholder. Any stocks financed through CDIC loans and held in bank escrows, as described earlier, would get a tax break similar to employee profit-sharing trusts, in that the corporation would get a tax deduction on any earnings paid as dividends into the bank escrows, provided that the tax saving were also paid into the bank escrow at the same time. In addition, any corporation using CDIC financing would be obligated to pay out most of its earnings as dividends if and when it needed additional funds for expansion. Instead of withholding earnings, it could get these funds through the sale of additional stock, which would be purchased by more individual families using more CDIC loans. Thus, by giving special tax treatment to stocks financed under this plan, and by requiring a high payout of earnings, virtually all of the 20% could go to the stockholder, first to pay off the loan, and then, ultimately, to pay the family a substantial second income. Next, how much newly issued stock might a typical family acquire? First, and very important, this plan does not propose any redistribution of existing stock. We cannot rebuild our private property economy by invading the rights of existing private property. Instead, the plan would include only the new stock created as U.S. industry expands. The current growth rate is somewhere between $40 to $60 billion a year. And how big is this? Well, if all of this growth could be financed through CDIC insured loans, it would be enough to allocate about $4,000 worth per year to each of 10 to 15 million families, or 1/6 to 1/4 of all the families in the United States. Thus, over a 5-year period, each family's holdings could grow from $4,000 to $8,000 to $12,000 to $16,000 to $20,000 in 5 years, enough to pay a second income of $80 per week if the dividends could continue to average 20% on invested capital. And this in turn would be true if we could ultimately do away with the corporate income tax, which is a double tax on capital, and if we could require corporations to pay out most of their earnings to the people who own the corporations, namely the stockholders. The foregoing rate of capital growth is about the best we can do with our present economy, which is now growing at a rate somewhere between 3 to 4% per year. However, this growth rate should increase dramatically as industry expands to meet the demand created by millions of families with second incomes. Thus, in addition to our present economy, we will have to build a whole new future economy, a second economy, which will have to be several times as big as our present one. At this point, you probably have a number of questions about the insured loan aspect of the plan. The same kind of searching questions that were asked and answered on the Homestead Act and on FHA. For instance, who decides who gets what stock? Under the Homestead Act, they had to decide who got what land. Or, where does the money come from? Under FHA, they had to decide where it came from to finance billions of dollars worth of new homes. Or, isn't the plan inflationary? Incidentally, it isn't. Or deflationary? Probably yes, and beneficially so. Or, isn't it a giant giveaway? Actually not. The stock is bought and paid for. Or, won't it mean more government interference? The answer is no. Or won't the families sell the stock and squander the money? In this regard, we might point out that with few exceptions, they didn't sell or squander their farms under the Homestead Act, nor do they now sell or squander their homes under FHA. Or another question, what will it do to the stock market? We hope it might take some of the hysterics out of it. Or, isn't it communistic, isn't it immoral, etc., etc. Now, answering all these questions to everybody's satisfaction could take hours, even days of earnest debate. Many of these points have been discussed in two thoughtful books by Louis Kelso and Mortimer J. Adler, entitled The Capitalist Manifesto and The New Capitalists, both published by Random House. These, in addition to many published articles, we hope you'll be interested enough to read all of them. Going back to our list of ways and means for implementing the plan, this same insured loan technique could be used on any government-sponsored revenue-producing project regardless of its size. Projects such as TVA, Appalachia, antitrust divestitures like DuPont stock and General Motors, or the sale of government assets like General Anilin, etc. In each case, thousands of families without prior savings could acquire stock in these projects by borrowing the money on an insured loan. The stock would remain in escrow at the bank until the loan was paid off in, say, 6 to 8 years, after which the family would own it and would get a second income from dividends. Our seventh ways and means suggested that corporations set up more employee stock ownership trusts. Now here, as an example, is how General Motors might have done it. General Motors recently added $3.2 billion in new capital to expand its capacity 20% and thus turn out about 1 million more vehicles per year. If this could have been done through an employee stock ownership trust, here's what would have happened. GM would have created what we call a positive equity generator trust, which would take in $3.2 billion in new General Motors stock. This trust would then go to a group of banks and borrow $3.2 billion, pledging the stock to secure the loan. It would then turn over the $3.2 billion to General Motors to pay for the stock. And General Motors, in turn, would guarantee the loan for the benefit of the trust. GM would thus have its $3.2 billion in cash with which to buy $3.2 billion worth of new plant capacity. Then, over the next few years, General Motors could make cash contributions into the trust, which to the corporation are tax-deductible, and cash dividend payments into the trust, which are presently not tax-deductible. Thus, in a few years, the trust would take in enough money to pay off the loan. Once the loan were paid off, the stock could be released to the 640,000 GM employees, who would then own an average of $5,000 each in General Motors stock, and this as a result of one single expansion program. By this device, General Motors could have created 640,000 small capitalists with second incomes, which would help them buy the 1 million extra vehicles which General Motors plans to produce. But, alas, General Motors did no such thing. Like all of the other 96% of current new capital formation, this entire $3.2 billion expansion program was financed internally, with no issuance of new stock. Thus, it will all wind up being owned by the same little 2.3% group that already owns most of General Motors and most of every other corporation as well. Our eighth and final ways and means has to do with death taxes. We estimate that total private U.S. wealth is well over $1,000 billion, with most of it owned by rich people who pass it along to their heirs about once every generation. Thus, perhaps $40 billion might change hands each year. Now, suppose we change the death tax on this private wealth so that a rich man could leave up to, say, $250,000 to his wife and to each child, tax-free, or he could leave them more if taxed. And then suppose he could give away all the rest of it tax-free on this one condition. If, after receiving the gift, the recipient were no richer than, say, $50,000, the gift would pass tax-free. And above that, of course, a graduated tax could apply. This single, simple change could create 1 million or more capital-owning families each year. Our present confiscatory death tax does not produce any significant amount of revenue for the government. All it does is drive the big estates into tax-exempt foundations where the wealth is frozen indefinitely. It is a bad law and ought to be changed. So much for the second income plan and how it works. And now, let's see what's in it for various groups. For labor, a chance to own a piece of the action and thus have an answer to automation. We say to labor, if a machine can take your job, this plan can help you own a share in the machine. For the impoverished, a chance to escape from poverty on a private income instead of a public handout. For the elderly, a chance to retire with dignity on a private, adequate, dependable income, and also a capital estate to pass on to one's heirs, thus assuring the elderly that their children will give them some consideration right down to the reading of the last will and testament. For youth, the tremendous challenge of building America into a nation of small capitalists, the gigantic task of creating a whole new second economy, one that will be owned by the 90% who now own no capital, and one that will do for this 90% what the existing economy now does for the capital-owning 5 to 10%. For farmers, a chance for the small and hence inefficient farmer to get out of farming if he wants to. Thus, ultimately, an end to price supports and government control of agriculture. For industry, a chance to move forward faster, to automate, to compete again in foreign markets. Today, industry has the materials, the potential capacity, the manpower, know-how, and managerial zeal to expand output at several times its present 3 to 4% rate. All it lacks is customers with purchasing power, which this second income plan could provide. For those who are already capitalists, a return to private property and the idea that if you own it, you should get what it produces. And ultimately, an end to the double tax on capital and an end to the corporate withholding of the earnings of capital. For foreign relations, a tremendous improvement in our position as leader of the free world. As we rebuild America into a nation of small capitalists, we can show the world how well our system works when everybody has a chance to produce at least a part of his living through his private ownership of capital. We can then offer this concept of capitalism to the neutral and undeveloped nations as a better answer than communism. Finally, for America in general, a stable economy, a rapidly expanding economy, two sources of income for most families, wages plus dividends, full employment, at least for several decades until automation could catch up with an economy growing at several times its present rate, a higher standard of living, lower income taxes, less government, and less government interference. It all adds up to a return to Route 1 and a private property economy that distributes to each according to what he produces. Only this time, it would be an economy that enables each to produce more by employing both his labor and his capital. This way lies economic freedom and economic justice for every American. And this is what the second income plan is all about.
You can join CESJ by going to cesj.org and clicking on Participate, and you can become a paying member for $25 per year, and also a student membership is $15 per year, and that qualifies you for discounts on our materials, such as books, which you can buy many of and distribute to your friends and family. And also, if you'd like to participate and comment on the podcast, feel free to call. I have a voicemail set up. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I'll play it on the podcast. The number is 678-719-2840. Own or be owned.